Well, I'm going to back it up just a little bit. Mama and I went down to Fort Worth for the Cowtown picking party. The little sign, it says walking, but they're on their phone texting.
If there was one thing Reba McEntire never wanted after her divorce, it was a public war. After 26 years of marriage, Reba and Narvel Blackstock went their separate ways in 2015. But the story didn't end with the divorce papers, because not long afterward, Narvel appeared to have moved on with another woman. And this wasn't just anyone. She was reportedly someone Reba already knew. A woman who had been around the family. A woman who had even shared moments with Reba before the marriage ended. For fans, the situation raised an uncomfortable question. How does a woman react when her former husband starts a new relationship with someone from their shared circle? For Reba, the answer was not what many people expected. She didn't launch a public attack. She didn't turn the situation into a celebrity feud. Instead, she chose a much quieter response. And years later, that response reveals something important about the woman behind the country music legend. But to understand why this relationship became such a sensitive subject, we have to go back to the beginning. The partnership that seemed impossible to break. Long before the divorce shocked country music fans, Reba and Narvel had built something much bigger than a marriage. They had built a life together. Narvel first became part of Reba's professional world in 1980, when he joined her band. At that point, Reba was already working hard to establish herself as a country singer. Her career was growing, but superstardom was still ahead of her. Narvel eventually moved from being a member of her band to becoming her manager. And that changed everything. Their professional relationship became deeply connected to their personal lives. In 1989, after years of knowing and working with each other, Reba and Narvel married. Their relationship seemed almost perfectly designed for the entertainment business. He understood the demands of her career. She trusted his judgment. Together, they raised a family and built one of country music's most successful careers. They welcomed their son, Shelby, and Reba also became a stepmother to Narvel's children from a previous marriage. From the outside, the partnership looked strong. But there was a hidden problem. Reba and Narvel weren't simply married. They worked together. They talked about business. They traveled together. Their careers were connected. And eventually, the line between marriage and business became almost impossible to separate. Years later, Reba acknowledged how much their professional lives had become intertwined. Even vacations could turn into conversations about work. For a couple, that can create an unusual kind of pressure. Because when the marriage is struggling, you can't simply leave the office. The office is your home. The home is your office. And your entire future is tied to the same person. Still, for decades, they made it work. Until suddenly, they didn't. On August 3, 2015, Reba and Narvel announced that they were separating. The news stunned fans. This wasn't a short celebrity marriage ending after a few years. This was a relationship that had lasted for more than 2 decades. They had spent 26 years as husband and wife. And they had known each other professionally for even longer. The end of their marriage meant much more than simply moving into separate homes. It meant separating two people whose lives had been connected in almost every possible way. Reba later admitted that the divorce wasn't what she wanted. That detail is easy to overlook, because from the outside, Reba remained calm and professional. But privately, the ending was painful. She had spent much of her adult life with Narvel. He had been her husband, her manager, the father of her son, and one of the people closest to her career. Yet Reba eventually came to accept that sometimes two people can reach a point where staying together only creates more unhappiness. So she made a decision. Move forward, not backward. And that decision would become even more important when Narvel started a new chapter of his own. After the divorce, reports began linking Narvel to Laura Putty Stroud, a Nashville real estate agent. Normally, an ex-husband finding a new partner would already be emotional enough. But this situation had another layer. Laura wasn't completely unknown to Reba. She had reportedly been part of the wider circle surrounding Reba and Narvel. There were photographs, shared events, family connections, moments that had taken place before anyone knew how complicated the future would become. At one point, Reba and Laura had even been seen together at a Katy Perry concert. At the time, there was nothing strange about it. Laura appeared to be someone Reba knew and trusted. Nobody looking at those pictures could have known that the relationship between these people would later become a source of public curiosity. Then everything changed. Narvel and Laura were reportedly together. And suddenly, those old photographs looked very different. Fans began asking the obvious question. What did Reba think about it? Was she angry? Was she hurt? Did she feel betrayed? And perhaps most importantly, would Reba finally speak about it? Because the public knows celebrities for their music, movies, and television appearances. But sometimes the most revealing moments happen when a celebrity refuses to say what everyone expects them to say. And Reba's response was exactly that. If the public expected Reba to attack her ex-husband's new relationship, they were disappointed. She didn't turn the situation into a public battle. She didn't spend interviews insulting Narvel. And she didn't make Laura the villain of her story. Instead, Reba repeatedly emphasized something much more important. She wanted peace. That doesn't mean the divorce didn't hurt. It doesn't mean seeing her former husband move on was easy. And it certainly doesn't mean every emotion disappeared overnight. But Reba understood something that many people only learn after a painful breakup. Not every feeling needs to become a public statement. Sometimes silence is a decision. And in Reba's case, it appears to have been a deliberate one. She had too much history with Narvel to destroy everything they had built. They still shared a son. They still had family connections. And Reba remained close to the children connected to their blended family. She understood that a divorce between two adults doesn't have to become a divorce from the entire family. That attitude may have been one of the hardest parts of the situation. Because when a relationship ends, anger can feel natural. But when children and decades of memories are involved, the consequences of that anger can last much longer. Reba chose to protect those relationships. And that choice tells us something about her. She wasn't interested in winning a public argument. She was interested in moving forward. But there was another reason her reaction mattered so much. Reba had already experienced loss on a scale that most people could never imagine. Years before her divorce, Reba experienced one of the darkest moments of her life. In March 1991, members of her touring band were killed when a plane crashed near San Diego. 10 people died in the accident, including 8 members of Reba's touring crew and the 2 pilots. These weren't strangers. They were people who had traveled with her, people she knew, people who had become part of her professional family. The loss devastated her. And yet, just days later, Reba had to stand in front of millions of people and perform at the Academy Awards. Imagine carrying that kind of grief while knowing the world is watching you. There was no easy way through it. Reba eventually turned her pain into music. Her album, For My Broken Heart, became one of the most successful and emotionally powerful records of her career. The album wasn't simply about sadness. It was about surviving something that could have destroyed her. That experience shaped the way Reba approached difficult moments later in life. She learned that pain doesn't disappear because you ignore it. But she also learned that pain doesn't have to control you forever. And years later, when her marriage ended, that same strength appeared again. Instead of allowing the divorce to define her, Reba rebuilt her life. She continued performing. She continued acting. She continued working. And eventually, she found happiness in new relationships and new experiences. But the story of Reba's love life actually began long before Narvel. Before Reba became Mrs. Blackstock, she was married to Charlie Battles. The two married in 1976, when Reba was still working to establish herself in country music. Charlie was a steer wrestling champion and rancher. Their relationship fit naturally into the world Reba had grown up in. Reba had been raised around ranches, rodeos, cattle, and hard work. But her music career was beginning to demand more and more of her time. And as Reba's career grew, the life she wanted professionally began moving in a different direction. The marriage ended in 1987. It was another turning point. Reba was leaving one chapter behind while moving toward something much bigger. Just 2 years later, she married Narvel. And this time, the relationship would last for more than 2 decades. That second marriage became one of the defining relationships of her life. But when it ended, Reba faced something she had never experienced before. She had to discover who she was without the man who had been beside her for most of her adult life. The years following the divorce could have been filled with bitterness. Instead, Reba focused on rebuilding. She continued her career. She remained connected to her family. And eventually, she began dating again. She later had a relationship with businessman and photographer Anthony Lasuzzo. Unlike her marriage to Narvel, this relationship wasn't tied to her professional life. It was more about companionship, travel, time together, and enjoying life away from the pressure of the music business. But even that relationship eventually ended. In 2019, Reba confirmed that she and Lasuzzo had separated. Yet once again, there was no explosive public feud. Reba explained that they had gone their separate ways but remained friends. And that pattern is important, because it shows how Reba handled the endings in her personal life. She didn't pretend that everything was perfect. She didn't deny that relationships could hurt. But she also didn't seem interested in turning heartbreak into entertainment. That becomes especially important when we return to Narvel, because his new relationship was different. This time, the person involved was connected to the world Reba herself had shared with him. And that made the situation much more personal. The biggest misunderstanding about Reba's response is assuming that silence means she didn't care. It doesn't. Sometimes silence means the exact opposite. It means the person has feelings but doesn't want those feelings to control the story. Reba had every reason to feel complicated emotions. Her marriage had ended. She had admitted that she didn't want the divorce. And then her former husband began a new relationship. For many people, that would be enough to reopen old wounds. But Reba had something else to consider. Her son, her stepchildren, her extended family, her career, and the legacy she had built over decades. One angry interview could have changed the entire public story. Instead of, Reba moves forward, the headline could have become, Reba attacks her ex. She didn't allow that to happen. She protected her own image. But more importantly, she protected her peace. And that may be the real lesson hidden inside this story. Because after spending decades in the public eye, Reba understood that the world doesn't need to know every private emotion. There are some battles that don't need an audience. Look at Reba's life as a whole and a pattern begins to emerge. She grew up in a family where hard work was expected. She entered the music business when success was far from guaranteed. She faced years of professional struggle. She lost members of her touring family in a devastating accident. She survived the end of 2 marriages. She watched people she loved move into new chapters without her. And through all of it, she kept going. That's what makes her response to Narvel's new relationship so interesting. The story isn't really about whether Reba approved. We may never know everything she felt privately. The story is about what she chose to do publicly. And she chose dignity. She chose family. She chose work. She chose the future. Perhaps that's why the situation never became the massive celebrity feud that many people expected. Reba didn't need to prove that she was hurt. She didn't need to convince the public that she was right. And she didn't need to compete with the woman who came after her. Her life was already moving in another direction.